There's a moment most people never notice when it happens. Nothing dramatic changes. No argument. No betrayal. No goodbye. Just a slow emotional shift that quietly changes the entire relationship. The messages still arrive. The conversations still happen. The affection still technically exists. But something feels different. The tension disappears first. Then the curiosity. Then the effort. And eventually, the respect. Because people often stop emotionally valuing someone the moment they become completely certain they won't lose them. That's the part nobody wants to admit out loud. At first, attachment feels beautiful. You stop pretending. You stop calculating responses. You stop protecting your emotions. You become emotionally available. Consistent. Safe. You answer faster. Stay longer. Forgive easier. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional presence becomes expected instead of appreciated. That's where the shift begins. Because familiarity doesn't always create closeness. Sometimes it removes observation. People stop noticing what constantly stays in front of them. The terrifying part is how subtle it feels in the beginning. They still talk to you. They still say your name softly. But their attention becomes thinner somehow. Less reactive. Less curious. Less emotionally alert. You notice yourself speaking while they scroll through their phone. You notice conversations becoming shorter. Less depth. Less tension. Less emotional hunger. You start carrying the emotional atmosphere by yourself. You ask more questions. Send longer messages. Keep conversations alive longer than they naturally want to survive. And eventually you realize something uncomfortable. You're no longer expressing yourself naturally. You're performing emotional relevance. Trying to recreate reactions that once happened effortlessly. That realization changes people quietly. Because nothing humiliates someone faster than feeling themselves becoming emotionally ordinary to a person who once intensely noticed them. And attachment accelerates that process. Especially when one person becomes emotionally certain the other will stay no matter what. That certainty changes behavior. People become less careful with what feels guaranteed. Replies slow down. Affection becomes inconsistent. Presence becomes casual. And the frightening part is how quickly the attached person adapts to emotional neglect just to preserve connection. You start accepting things that once would have deeply bothered you. Delayed replies. Half-hearted attention. Dry conversations. Reduced enthusiasm. You tell yourself they're just tired. Busy. Distracted. But deep down, you already feel the emotional distance growing. You sense it before it's spoken aloud. That strange feeling when someone still talks to you, but no longer emotionally reaches for you. And once people feel that shift, they begin doing something dangerous. They start chasing emotional reassurance. Not because they're weak. Because they're scared. Scared the emotional intensity is disappearing. So they begin checking for signs constantly. Checking whether the message was seen. Rereading old conversations late at night. Watching how fast they reply to other people. Noticing how much more alive they sound around strangers. And that comparison destroys people internally. Because nothing hurts more than watching someone give effortless attention to others that now feels difficult to receive from them. Especially when you remember how naturally they once gave it to you. That's what attachment does. It makes people emotionally dependent on reactions that used to happen freely. And eventually the relationship changes from connection into monitoring. You stop enjoying the interaction. You start analyzing it. You notice tone changes. Punctuation changes. Response timing. Energy shifts. The absence of enthusiasm. The absence of curiosity. The absence of emotional pursuit. And once someone begins searching for reassurance inside every interaction, respect usually starts collapsing internally. Because emotional dependence changes behavior in ways people don't realize. You become more careful, more accommodating, more emotionally available. You tolerate inconsistency because occasional affection now feels emotionally relieving. That's the dangerous part. The attached person slowly lowers emotional standards just to maintain emotional access. And most people never notice how much self-respect disappears during the process. You start pretending things don't hurt. Pretending silence doesn't affect you. Pretending distance feels normal. Pretending you're emotionally secure while internally panicking over behavioral changes nobody else can see. And eventually you become emotionally exhausted from acting unaffected. Because attachment creates a quiet fear most people secretly live with. The fear of becoming emotionally replaceable. That fear changes everything. You begin speaking more carefully. You overthink simple messages. You become hyper-aware of emotional reactions. You notice when they laugh harder with someone else. When they respond faster to other people. When they suddenly have emotional energy for everyone except you. Those moments damage people more than arguments ever could. Because arguments still contain emotional intensity. Indifference doesn't. And indifference is usually where respect fully dies. Not immediately. Quietly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. You feel it during conversations first. They stop asking deeper questions. They stop reacting emotionally to your presence. Your attention becomes expected instead of stimulating. Your affection becomes predictable. And predictable things rarely create emotional tension for long. That's why emotional certainty changes attraction so dangerously. People rarely notice they became emotionally predictable until the attention fades. Until enthusiasm disappears. Until affection starts feeling routine instead of emotionally alive. Then panic begins. Not externally. Internally. You begin trying to recover emotional reactions naturally fading away. You become slightly more available. Slightly more attentive. Slightly more emotionally giving. But strangely, the more emotionally available you become, the less psychological impact you seem to create. And that realization humiliates people quietly. Because it forces them to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes love slowly removes the exact tension attraction originally depended on. That's the truth people struggle admitting. The moment someone completely stops fearing your absence, emotional dynamics change. Not always intentionally. Not always maliciously. But they change. Because urgency disappears once emotional access feels permanent. People stop emotionally chasing what already belongs to them psychologically. And the attached person feels this shift immediately. Even if nobody says it aloud. You feel it in the pauses. In the reduced excitement. In the conversations that now feel like maintenance instead of connection. You notice yourself waiting for reactions that used to happen naturally. Waiting for enthusiasm. Waiting for emotional effort. Waiting to feel emotionally important again. And eventually the relationship becomes emotionally asymmetrical. One person monitors. The other person relaxes. One person overthinks. The other person assumes stability. One person fears loss. The other person stops imagining it. That imbalance quietly destroys respect on both sides. Because the more emotionally dependent person slowly begins abandoning parts of themselves to preserve emotional proximity. You stop expressing discomfort honestly. You avoid conflict to avoid distance. You become agreeable when you actually feel hurt. You suppress emotional needs because you're terrified of sounding difficult. And eventually you no longer recognize your own behavior. You become emotionally strategic instead of emotionally authentic. That's when attachment becomes self-betrayal. The frightening part is how normal it starts feeling. You feel relieved over basic attention now. A fast reply suddenly changes your mood. A small compliment emotionally carries you for hours. One affectionate moment temporarily erases weeks of emotional confusion. And that emotional imbalance becomes addictive. Because inconsistent attention creates obsession faster than stable affection ever could. So you stay emotionally invested hoping the old intensity returns. But most people don't realize something devastating. They're no longer attached to who the person is. They're attached to who the person used to be. To the emotional intensity. The curiosity. The pursuit. The feeling of being deeply noticed. And once that emotional atmosphere disappears, people begin grieving while the relationship technically still exists. That's why some relationships emotionally die months before either person leaves. The conversations continue. The routines continue. The attachment continues. But emotionally, something already collapsed. You can feel it during silence. During dinner conversations that feel empty. During moments where both people are physically present but emotionally elsewhere. And eventually one person begins adapting to emotional loneliness inside the relationship itself. That's the darkest stage. Because emotional loneliness beside someone feels heavier than loneliness alone. You start missing versions of them that no longer appear naturally. You replay old memories searching for reassurance that the connection was once real. You reread old messages, old reactions, old affection, trying to understand where the emotional atmosphere changed. But most of the time, there wasn't one single moment. Just accumulated emotional certainty, accumulated predictability, accumulated attachment. And slowly, respect disappeared underneath it. Because people often protect what feels temporary. But they relax around what feels permanently secured. That's the dangerous paradox of attachment. The more emotionally guaranteed someone feels, the less emotionally alert people sometimes become toward losing them. And eventually the attached person notices something terrifying. Their absence no longer changes anything. That realization destroys people quietly. You stop feeling emotionally significant. You stop feeling psychologically impactful. You begin sensing that your presence no longer emotionally alters the room the way it once did. And once someone feels emotionally tolerated instead of emotionally desired, something inside them starts collapsing. That's when people become desperate without visibly appearing desperate. They try becoming more interesting again. More understanding. More emotionally useful. But emotional overeffort rarely restores lost tension. It usually exposes emotional imbalance even more. And people feel that imbalance instinctively. Even without words. That's why attachment changes respect so brutally. The attached person slowly starts revolving emotionally around someone who has already emotionally relaxed. And eventually the relationship becomes psychologically unequal. One person still fears losing. The other person stopped thinking about it a long time ago. That difference changes everything. The tone. The effort. The emotional energy. The emotional power. And most people don't recognize how much dignity they slowly sacrifice trying to keep emotional closeness alive. That's the part that stays with people afterward. Not just losing someone, but realizing how much of themselves disappeared while trying not to lose them. Because attachment slowly teaches people to abandon self-respect in exchange for emotional reassurance. And the terrifying part, it rarely feels dangerous while it's happening. It just feels like love. Until one day you notice you've become emotionally exhausted trying to maintain a connection that used to maintain itself naturally. And by then, the emotional atmosphere has already changed completely. Because respect often dies long before attachment does. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, subscribe for more psychological explorations of human behavior.